The way a lot of houses are constructed now, the windows are really low on the front, and it's very difficult to find shrubs that will stay under those very low windows. Lots of plant breeders working on it, coming up with evergreen things. A lot of things that stay below 2 feet in height, we would actually consider ground covers, and they start to really spread out super wide. But if you're looking for something that you can maintain, that looks shrub-like, and you can keep 2 foot or below, this is the video for you. Everything I'm about to show you will try to get taller than 2 feet, but can easily be controlled with timely pruning, just a couple times a year. What you don't want to do is ever let these things get really, really tall and then cut them back, because then they won't have any foliage on them. So it's a more consistent maintenance. Easy, but consistent maintenance will keep them low and perfect little evergreens, because I think most folks want something that's evergreen right around the envelope of the foundation. And that's the way I've always tried to design. When I do design, I don't mind things going to sleep. I don't mind things losing their leaves. I like things that go dormant. Winter is winter, and it should look like, the garden should look like winter, but there probably is a little envelope around the foundation of a house that it's kind of nice to have things that stay consistent year round. So let's jump right in. This is a dwarf Yaupon holly. This is a native holly to the southeast United States. This is a dwarf version of it. This one, particular variety, is called Bordeaux. And you can see the new foliage coming out on that, how it has kind of a wine color. That's the reason this one's called Bordeaux. You'll frequently run into one called Schilling's dwarf. It's probably the most common of the named varieties of dwarf Yaupon hollies. We have a dwarf Yaupon holly in our neighborhood that's 6 feet tall. It's probably been there 30 to 40 years. That's how long it took to get that high. So keep in mind, again, this group of plants will get taller than that. But then we were down in South Carolina recently, and they had made a little knot garden, or a little walled garden, basically, like people would think about doing with boxwoods, but with dwarf Yaupon hollies. And it looked absolutely fantastic, and they've maintained them below 2 feet in height for as long as you want to maintain them at that height. They're not in a big hurry, and so it's very easy to keep them that size. So they can just be pruned back into that ball below. So what I would do is, if you want to keep them around 2 feet, is prune them down to about 18 inches, and then let them grow back out of that for a little while, so they, so they have a kind of a nice form. And then when they reach that height again, slightly above where you want to keep them, cut them a little further than you actually want to keep them, so that you can wait a little while and you don't have to constantly be out there pruning them. Everything in this video, including the dwarf Yaupon hollies, are for full sun. So this is the full sun list. We're going to do an additional video on 10 evergreen shrubs that can be kept 2 feet or under, 4-part shade. This is Rose Creek Abilia, and there's going to be a couple Abilia in this video. Abilia make just great little low doming evergreen shrubs. And this is, again, this is a green foliage variety called Rose Creek. Blooms with white flowers, a little bit of a pink hue to them. All summer long. Abilia bloom typically later than other shrubs. And we've got a couple flowers on ours at the house, but once these get going, this Rose Creek's really fantastic. It has the white flowers, and then where the flower connects to the plant, the little calyx on it has kind of a rose color, and that's why this one's called Rose Creek. So even after it finishes blooming, those little calyxes that are left where the flower was look like there's still flowers on it, which is it's just a great plant. Again, this one's going to be listed 3 to 4 feet in height, but as soon as, what you can do in the early spring is cut it down to about 18 inches and then let it flush out, and then it will bloom all summer long. Let it go to sleep like that in the winter time. Again, early spring, cut it about 6 inches below where you want it to flower, and it'll flower right in that 2 foot range for you every year. Again, there's going to be a variegated one, but I want to point out Rose Creek, because Rose Creek is a great, really industrial little, mounding evergreen shrub that's, thrives in full sun. The beginning of this video is at Swift Creek Nursery down in Johnston County, North Carolina. My nursery was only a mile or two from this nursery, and Lanny Thomas, the owner here, and I root a lot of things for him. We've known each other for a long, long time. In fact, I used to help Stephanie, and I worked at a garden center a long time ago together when we first met, unloading trucks from this nursery at a garden center when we were just very young people. So this is the kind of very long relationship we've had with Swift Creek Nursery. I'm a big fan of having something in the base of a garden that just stays the same year round, and then But our garden is a lot of one-of-a-kinds, things that have been given to us, things that have been, you know, passed down, really interesting things throughout the garden. But we do have a base of a few things there that just kind of rest the eye and stay the same year round. And that's kind of the base or the bones of the garden, so to speak. This plant I'm standing in here is Hellerai holly. It's a Japanese holly that's been around for a long, long time. It's a low doming holly. You can see how they've been pruned here. This one I've seen them as tall as 4 feet in height or so and 5 or 6 feet in width. This one definitely grows slightly wider than tall. There are lots of these Japanese holly cultivars, named varieties in the trade. So you'll see soft touched, you'll see touch of gold is one we have at the house. It has the gold foliage. There's actually a gold Hellerai. All of these are easy to keep down in that 2 foot in height range. Again, once or twice a year pruning. Again, always prune them a little more than you want to keep them, so you don't have to walk back out the next week or a month later and prune them immediately. If you're only pruning them to the height you need to keep them, as soon as they start growing, they're already taller than you want to keep them. So cut them down a little bit lower. The one that next to me here, this is Carissa holly. And I had Carissa hollies on my foundation at the old house, if you've watched since the beginning of this video. In fact, there's a video on how to remove old shrubs. It was the Carissa hollies that were on that foundation. 23 years, I kept them right at 2 feet in height, about 3 feet in width. And so this is another one. It's going to get 4 or 5 feet out in the wild if you never prune it, but it's really, really easy to keep this plant. 23 years, I kept these 2 feet in height, 3 feet in width, and just basically twice a year pruning maybe. That's all it took to do that. Carissa will get some reversion in it. It'll get some, these are, if you'll notice, these leaves have a little single point on the end. They will revert back to rotundifolia, which has 5 points on it. If you see any of that reversion in it, cut it out quick, cut it back down into the plant. But easy plant to keep small permanently, or at least, you know, a couple decades, and then have more interesting things out in front of it. They just turned on the irrigation behind us, but I wanted to show you this Hetz midget arborvitae. This is an eastern arborvitae that can be kept very, very small. Perfect little round ball. We're going to show you one other conifer in this video that also grows that way. There are several of these named varieties or named cultivars of dwarf arborvitae like this that can all be kept small. If you get the regular globe arborvitae, they can get, I had one at the old house that ended up 4 or 5 feet tall. I eventually had to take it out. It just, the pace of growth meant that any pruning I was doing on it was just, you know, taken away really, really quickly, and it started to look awkward. So definitely find one of these that has dwarf in the name or something like that, and should be very easy to keep these in that 2 foot range. We're doing a video about tough evergreen ornamental plants that can take full sun and stay under, you know, be kept around the 2 feet in height range. I will say on those Thuja occidentalis, folks in the colder areas can definitely have them out in the full sun. As you get toward the southern climate, those eastern arborvitaes or eastern arbs or eastern thujas, whatever you want to call them, are a little less tolerant of full sun as the further south you go. So keep that in mind. And this is another one that's kind of the same to me. This is soft touch holly. This is another Japanese holly. I mentioned it when I was talking about the Hellerais over there. Lots and lots of these get sold. And this one, you hardly have to do any pruning to it whatsoever to keep it 2 feet or under. It just kind of grows that way. You can see how compact it is. But in general, I don't think this is a really tough landscape ornamental plant. I see these dying all over the place, and I think it really is a water issue. So if you do use soft touch hollies, make sure that you're giving them some ongoing irrigation. Don't, you know, most plants I put in the ground, and over a 2 or 3 year span, you know, I start to trust more and more and more that they can just kind of be on their own, right? As long as we're keeping them mulched, keeping the weeds away from them, you know, doing our general maintenance, they need less and less from me. This is not a plant that I'm ever going to trust with that situation. So if it becomes abnormally dry at any point, even an established soft touch holly, I'm going to drag a water hose over to it and give it some additional water. But this is one, I will say, almost no pruning necessary to keep this as 2 foot tall and 3 foot wide almost permanently. This is an Encore azalea called Autumn Embers. If you go over to the Encore azalea website, they have them grouped by color, they have them grouped by size. So you can go over to the size page and then look for the dwarf encore azalea. So Autumn Fire is on that list. I think they have Autumn Bonfire on that list. Autumn Angel, no, maybe it'd be Angel. Ivory, I can't remember them all right this minute off the top of my head, but there is a list of the encores that only reach, I think on most of the tags you're gonna see around 3 feet. But Autumn Embers, you see how kind of prostrate the growth habit is on this. You get a lot of branching that's this direction out on it, and it's easy to keep this one smaller than others. These you would prune once a year after their spring flowering. That would be the time to prune them. So they're gonna bloom heavily in the spring. You give them a haircut, again, down below where you're trying to keep them so that they flush back out, and by fall, they'll bloom again. Sometimes also in midsummer, but definitely in the fall, they'll put on an even heavier flowering than they did in the spring. They'll go to sleep, come back in the spring, bloom again, and then you prune them again about 6 inches lower than you're trying to keep them. And you can keep this one that way for a long time. Any of the ones that are listed as dwarfs. So when we think of azaleas, we're usually thinking about part shade or shade plants, but the breeding work that was done on these encores, they definitely need more sun than traditional azaleas. So those of you, this one is a zone 6 to 10 variety. Those in zone 6, zone 7, maybe 8A, definitely can put them in pretty much full sun. As you get a little further south, I think you'd want to back them into a little bit of shade, but they still need 4 to 6 hours of direct sun in order to bloom and be full. All right, jumping back over to the house to complete our list of sun-loving, low-growing shrubs. This is Radiance Abilia, and I've actually let these now get up to closer to 3 feet in height, but I wouldn't have any problem whatsoever taking a foot of height out of these tomorrow and keeping them lower than that. But they're perfect little low domes. This is 3 of them that we've allowed to grow together to be basically a little low hedge, and we have some annual flowers out in front of them. But you can see the great variegation, which is quite a bit different than that Rose Creek Abilia. This one flowers heavily, and it will start in about middle of June typically, although some of the Abilia are blooming a little earlier this year in our area. It's typically more toward the middle of June, and then they'll just flat out bloom all the way until fall, and the pollinators absolutely love them. And then it looks like this 12 months out of the year. There won't be a lot of conifers in this particular video, but there are a ton of conifers that you can keep down in that 2-foot range, from ground cover junipers to junipers that only get 18 inches, 24 inches. I mean, there'll be a lot of conifer choices for this. One of our absolute favorites is this little cryptomeria right here called Dragon Prince. And Dragon Prince is pretty similar to Globosa nana cryptomeria, but Globosa nana I've seen as tall as 6 feet in height. Again, it can be kept much lower than that, but it will creep up a little more. This Dragon Prince has been in this container for 2 years, and it's only put on maybe 4 or 5 inches of growth during that time. We have another one planted in the back garden. It's been in the ground over 3 years. It's only about 18 inches in height, a little wider than tall. Perfect little low doming evergreen. This one will also take part shade or sun, so it's very versatile. And again, it's just, look at this, how incredibly compact this is. It's also soft to the touch, which is on, some conifers are not. Next up is a dwarf Indian hawthorn. There are Indian hawthorns like the one over my shoulder right here that become almost small trees. And then we have lots of dwarf cultivars out in the world. A lot of them have succumbed to some leaf spot issues over the last 20 years or so. And so the foliage is not clean on them. They tend to shed leaves in very humid weather, and seem to just be less tolerant of humidity and heat in general. This one is called Clean Sweep Snowbank, and it was selected and picked and bred for leaf spot resistance, and it's incredibly clean foliage on this one. And if you know anything about Indian hawthorns, when the foliage is perfect, it's quite striking. And this one comes out, blooms white, blooms pretty heavily. I've never really used Indian hawthorns so much for the flowers because it's a fairly short flowering window. I mainly use them for the great rich green foliage and something that's just kind of like that stabilizing piece in the bed, because a lot of the other things we have planted in and around it go to sleep in the winter time, and this thing looks great 12 months out of the year. Next up is a Laura Petalum called Purple Daydream. This one has been in the ground close to 3 years now, and it's just maybe a hair over 2 feet at the very center. You can see how it has a kind of a weeping, spreading habit. I believe this is probably the best of the dwarf Laura Petalum at this point. It's It has fantastic color throughout. A lot of the old Petalum had all of the purple foliage was just out in the new growth, and then it matured to green. This one is purple all the way throughout the plant. It has an almost red flower. It has that little frilly flower like you'd see on witch hazels. It's in the same family as witch hazel. But this one's almost red. It's such a dark pink that I would, like, again, call it red. Look at the compact habit of this thing. This thing hadn't been pruned. It's been sitting here for 3 years just like this. If it got a little crazy limb that came up higher than I wanted, I could cut it off whenever I want to. These will bloom heavily in the spring. They'll put on some growth like it's doing now. Looks great out here in the garden year round. And then sometime in September, we'll start to get cooler nights again, and we'll get a few residual flowers on it. But this is just such a fantastic plant. And look at it with this Evergreen carex, the gold grass-like plant there. This Miss Lemon Abilia back here, which is similar to Radiance, but tends to get a little taller than Radiance. This gold Agastache that's sitting next to it with the purple flowers about to come out on it. All of this looks great together. It's just such a nice pop of color with these other things. The last one we're going to show you for this video is a Dicentium called Bayou Bliss. This is just a really great Dicentium. It has blue-green foliage. It stays incredibly compact. These do fantastic in the full sun. We've actually got this one in quite a bit of shade. And I would thought it would have been stretching, and it's not at all. It's still staying super, super compact. It's got just a low spreading habit. This one gets, we don't really grow Dicentium. Dicentium's in that same family with the Petalum and the witch hazel, and it gets the same kind of frilly flowers, but they're very small on Dicentium. But this is the most floriferous Dicentium I have seen. It has lots of red flowers along the stems in the early spring, and it's actually very showy. It's one of the first Dicentium I've seen where I went, wow, that's actually a great flowering plant as well. This is a Brigadoon St. John's wort with it, so this blue-green foliage just looks fantastic against it. This one, again, would prefer a little more sun. I've got to get these shrubs cut off the top of it and to get a little more light on it to make sure it's staying full. But these are just great, great full sun, tough ornamental plants, and you see more and more of them. Nobody knew what a Dicentium was 20 years ago, and now almost every landscape job I see going in, literally, and in the, you know, the cities, installations on parks and that kind of thing. Dicentium everywhere. In fact, we were in New York City last year and saw them up in Washington Square. There was a little planting of Dicentium. I don't know if they survived the winter up there, but it was interesting to see how far Dicentium had gone and how fast it's gone there. But there you go, there's 10 plants that you can use in the full sun that will stay, that can be kept somewhere in that 2-foot range. Again, plants don't read tags. And so I'm sitting here telling you, you can keep these things around that 2-foot range. And they're things that mostly are going to try to get wider than tall, but they're going to go through that. And so you need to know the proper timing to prune them. Most things you prune after they flower. Some things you can prune in the wintertime. I got lots of pruning videos on the channel if you want to learn more about that. Thank you guys for following along. What's your go-to evergreen low-growing shrub for your area of the country?